Hello, Michelle here with part 13. I'm going to just start with a short reading from Isaiah 55, verses 6 through 9. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call you upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. And let him return to the Lord, and he will have mercy upon him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, said the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. That is quite a mouthful right there. That's really why we need the Bible, because our thoughts are not his thoughts, and he is so much greater and bigger and everything than us. And we expect, in our pride, if we think we're so intelligent and we think we can understand who and what our creator is. And he's life, he's love, he's good things. We know that if we've lived long enough and if we've learned to come in alignment with him. And I always had a problem with the Bible for a long time. And now it's something that I really try to read or listen to some of it every single day, because it helps keep me on the narrow path which Jesus told us we need to stay on if we want to experience the kingdom of heaven, both in our being now and in the future when we live on the new recreated earth after his second coming. Okay, so as usual, I have remembered a lot of things that I had passed over in part 12 and previous parts. And I remembered some amusing stories and also a story of warning that I want to share from the days that I lived in the ashram in Denver. I had a friend there. Her name was Sandy. She was very petite. She was probably about 4'11", and she was a fun friend that I had. I didn't have many close friends in the ashram, but she's one of the very few. And she had a real mischievous streak. And one of the funny things that happened I want to tell you about. What happened was, I told you for 3 years I was transcribing Maharaji's speeches. But actually the last months that I lived in the ashram, they took me off of that. I was told that I was too attached to that service and I needed to give other people an opportunity to do it. And to tell you the truth, that made me feel like my purpose had gone away in the ashram. But and I was disappointed. But anyway, I was given a service to do at what by then was the international headquarters of Divine United Organization. I was given a service to be the PBX operator on the graveyard shift in the Kittredge building. And during that time, there would always be very few people in that building. There would be the night watchman and me. And I don't know why Sandy was always there. I don't even know if she had a service at night there. I really don't remember. And then there might be one or two other people once in a while that were there all night in their own offices that we probably didn't even see. That was about it at night. And anyhow, she was there a lot of the time. And it might be because she was such an energetic person and she just had a lot of energy left over after the day. I don't know. Anyway, we would get really hungry, like if you're staying up all night and working, you tend to get the munchies. And they had a big cafeteria area on another floor, and that was where they would feed everybody lunches. And so it held hundreds of people at one time with long tables and everything. And there was a fairly, not that large of a kitchen, but it was large enough that was on in that room in one of the corners. And they had put double and triple locks on it because people were, I guess, always trying to get in when the office was closed, and they didn't want people to get into the kitchen. And this is what's so funny is, so the night watchman, he was our friend, and he also would get the munchies, and he had no problem if we could find a way to get into that kitchen. And in the kitchen, there was I don't know, maybe one or two refrigerators and just large quantities of whatever they had. Great big blocks of cheese and great big buckets full of tofu and, whatever else. And anyhow, we wanted to get into that kitchen, and Sandy said, "Oh, I think I can get in there." And what she did was, there were these really tall windows in that cafeteria room. They were probably 5 feet to 6 feet tall. And she could get up to the top of that window frame and then climb up onto the, I don't know, whatever you call it. There was a space in there where she could climb up and crawl across the room to where the kitchen was and come back down from inside the kitchen and unlock it from inside. And then that way we were able to get in. Nobody ever figured out how people got into that kitchen. They knew they could tell people were getting in there, but nobody ever figured out how she did it. Certainly not something I could have done. And anyway, she'd do that and would, make fry tofu and make grilled cheese sandwiches and whatever. And our munchies, we get to munch. I thought that was kind of a funny story. And then another one is, at one point, she and I lived in the same ashram. It was kind of, I don't remember what year it was, but it was the year that the swine flu happened, the famous swine flu. And the authorities and powers that were in a big hurry to get a vaccination out for the swine flu. And it was in the news. We weren't allowed in the ashram to have TVs, radios, or TVs, radios. I don't remember what else, but we were pretty much cut off from all that until, like, that last year I was in the ashram. Things kind of loosened up a bit, especially in this particular ashram that had somebody that was an executive living with us, and it was a smaller ashram. There was only maybe 8 to 10 people at the most living in that ashram, which for the Denver ashrams was a very small one. I think they had half a dozen ashrams somewhere along those lines. Anyhow, each ashram had what was called a house mother, and the main job of the house mother would be to go to the grocery that Divine Light Mission or Divine United Organization owned. It was called the Rainbow Grocery, and they would be able to go there and get the food needed for feeding us, and then they would make our meals, breakfast and dinner. Usually we're all gone for lunchtime. They also did our laundry, and anyhow, Sandy, she's a very energetic girl, and she did those things, and she also secretly took on a part-time job so she could make money to spend more money on the food that she was fixing us. She wanted to fix us really special food, it's things that she couldn't get at Rainbow Grocery or that cost too much otherwise. And so she had a little part-time job. I think it might have been as a waitress, but I really don't remember. And of course, that was our secret. She told me, but I didn't tell anyone. And one day, she and the house father, every house had a house father. And the house father was always like, he'd be the boss. You know, if he said something, that's the way it goes. Usually the house fathers didn't say much or do much, but this particular house father did. And I think he had a problem with Sandy. Something Sandy did or didn't do, he had a problem with it. I don't remember what it was. And they had a fight about it. And then she disappeared. Nobody saw her. Gosh, I think it was a whole week. I didn't know where she was either. She and I shared the same bedroom, but I didn't see her in that whole week. And but we'd get up in the morning, and there'd be breakfast on the table, a beautiful breakfast, fresh squeezed orange juice, pancakes, whatever, you know, eggs, and well, no, not eggs. One of the rules of the ashram was no meat, fish, or eggs. So there's no eggs. She might scramble tofu to make it look like eggs or whatever. But she'd have a big breakfast out on the table. We'd get up and no Sandy. Nobody saw where she was. And they'd ask each other, did you see her? Nobody ever saw her. And the food would be there. And we'd eat and put our dishes in the sink in the kitchen and go to our respective services during the day. And then when we would get home, 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, probably closer to 6, I guess, I don't know, there would be a whole spread out on the table again. It would be a beautiful dinner. It was usually like a 2 or 3 course dinner all there on that. It was like a giant picnic table that we had in the dining room with wooden benches. And the dishes would have been done from that morning, and the dinner was out there, and no Sandy. And we all wondered where she was. And what finally ended up happening is one evening, I got in a mood to write a letter. And there was a cabinet, there was a kind of lower down cabinet in our bedroom where it was, I had kept my stationery. And I opened that cabinet to get out the stationery, and there was Sandy. She was all bundled, she was all curled up in a fetal position, asleep inside that little cabinet. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's where she'd been the whole time. She'd come out and do all that stuff when she knew nobody was home, and then she'd go back in there and sleep. Anyway, I thought that was pretty hilarious. And and so now the word of warning. A couple things. One thing happened one day. We had windows where there'd be nails put on the windows so you couldn't open them too far. And that way, because we lived in the Capitol Hill area of Denver. And so it was to try to keep thieves away, robbers that might try to come in our windows during the day when no one was home. And so you couldn't open our windows very far. And one day we came home and the whole house had been ransacked. Boy, whoever the thieves were must have been pretty disappointed, because we didn't even have a TV set, I don't think, at that point. We didn't have radios. We didn't have the kind of stuff thieves like to steal. Remember, the only thing of mine they took was my little travel alarm clock. And all of our those of us who had dressers, and with drawers, those had been all opened and dumped on the floor, and it was a feeling, almost like feeling like you'd been raped. It was really, really weird. We found out later that there was some gang of thieves in town that they had some little kids that they would use the little kids that push them through the windows to go open the door to let them in, and that's how they would rob us. So anyway, one of the things that happened when I lived there, there was a guy named Scott Heath, and he was in his late 20s, I believe, and I'm sure he was in his late 20s. And he was very intellectual, very talented. He was some kind of top guy in, I think it was in publishing in the ashram. Can't really remember exactly what he did because I never worked right next to him or seeing what he did, but it was something impressive. He was very smart. And anyway, remember we had sort of a joke going because he liked to drink spring water, and I liked to drink distilled water. I thought distilled water was more pure than spring water. And so we would have a pitcher of spring water and a pitcher of distilled water on the table every day, and they would be labeled. And he changed the labeling to whole and skim. The distilled was skim and his was whole. And I think in the end he was right. If it's a good spring, you are better off with spring water, in my opinion. But anyway, I didn't know him very well, but we sort of had that joke going on. And so then the swine flu came out. Everybody heard about it, even we did, because I mean, like I said, we didn't I think at some point we actually did get a TV set, but I'm not sure. But somehow we all knew about the swine flu, and that the government was telling us we should go get the injections so that we wouldn't get the swine flu, which was so dangerous. And in the news, they talked about it, how they were kind of hurrying it out to everybody. And one of the ingredients of it had to do with from the eggs of pigs, or the embryos of pigs. And that just grossed me out. I did not want anything injected into me that had something that was both, it seemed to be experimental, they hadn't tested it, and it had that stuff from pigs in it. So I did not get that vaccination. And but I did get, during that time, we were being, from time to time, we'd be encouraged to get some outside jobs to help bring money in for the ashram. And at that time, I got a temporary job, and it was working at a place to answer the phone for people who called to see where to go get their swine flu shot. And I was put in a upstairs room with just a table and a telephone and some maps of Denver and some wording in case somebody asked a question about something. And people would call, and I would answer, and they would say, I live in this part of town, where do I go to get my swine flu shot? And I would tell them. But I didn't like that shot. I didn't trust it. And back then, people weren't doing things like recording your phone calls, and there wasn't surveillance like that. And this was like the early to mid 70s. I guess it was the mid 70s. And anyhow, if somebody called, they might ask me where to go, and they'd say, and then if they said something like, I don't know if I'm going to get that or not. I'm not sure if I should get this vaccine. And if they said anything like that, I would say, oh, I'm not going to get it. I don't trust it. It's got that stuff from pigs in it. And I knew that whoever hired me to answer those phones would not be happy with me doing that, but that's what I did. Anytime somebody would make an opening like that, I would warn them. I'd encourage them to not get the shot. I felt kind of guilty about it at the time, but of course later, when there were so many really bad results for people that got the swine flu shot, I didn't feel guilty about it anymore. Anyhow, this guy, Scott Heath, who lived in our house, he thought it was a good idea to get the vaccine, and he had went and got it. And one morning he got up and he couldn't pour his orange juice. And I think it was by the end of that day he couldn't even walk. And what ended up happening was he ended up, within a very short amount of time, he lost his ability to speak, walk, or anything. I wasn't ever around him very much, and I wish I had been a compassionate enough person at that time to have made it my business to be around him more and see how he was doing, but I didn't. And luckily he had a good friend who I don't think lived in the ashram, and she was there for him. And last time I had saw him, he was in a wheelchair and he couldn't speak. And it was all from that swine flu shot. And from what I heard later, it took him years of therapy, but he did, over a period of years, learn how to walk again and learned how to speak again. And it was a long journey for him. But anyway, while all that was going on with the swine flu and a lot of people were getting really bad reactions, President Ford, I'm pretty sure he was the president at the time, he decided to give full immunity to all the vaccine companies, I think, I'm sure they were included, and all the doctors who had given the shots. And that left poor Scott in a position where he couldn't apply for some of the help he needed. And I actually saw him decades later. He was in an article in the Denver Post talking about all of that. They had a little article about it, and I was glad to see he was still around. And okay, so that, I think, is all I wanted to fill in about. Oh, yeah, there was one other thing. Not my favorite thing to confess to people, but yeah, there was a man who was, he had a service to be like a gopher. And he was kind of cute. My stepmother later met him, and she thought he looked like Tony Orlando. I didn't think so, but that's what she thought. And but he was a cute guy and kind of small for a man, and I was kind of large for a woman. But it really surprised me that he was trying to make passes at me when I'd be in my little office that was between the bathrooms. And one day he was like being particularly assertive in trying to seduce me, and he sat in my lap. I was very taken aback, and I was very surprised, and I couldn't understand why he was interested in me. But over time, he would come visit me a lot, and one day he said, "Oh, I want to show you something on the 8th floor," whatever the very top attic of the Kittredge building was. I don't remember what floor that was. So I want to show you something, and he talked me into going with him. And we went out, and he talked me into going into this place where it was sort of above the ceiling of the top floor of the building. And it was kind of like being up in a little attic. And then he started making passes at me, kissing me. And I succumbed to the kissing. He wanted to go further than that. I already felt real guilty while we were kissing because I knew it wasn't allowed in the ashram. And I was very obedient about being celibate, at least up until that point. And he was trying to go further than that, but I just wouldn't do it. And that happened. That was one of the things that happened in the ashram. Then when I moved out, he pursued me again. He no longer lived in the ashram, and I no longer lived in the ashram. And he started taking me out and we had sexual relations. Somewhere during that time, I don't know if it had already happened or if it happened during that time, he met another girl who was a follower of the guru, but she did not live in the ashram, and she got pregnant by him. And he married her, and but he still wanted to go out with me. Another example of how my heart was getting hardened, because when I was younger, I was very against doing something like going out with a married man. But instead it was we don't know our own hearts. People tend to think, oh yeah, follow your heart. But what we don't realize, and one thing it teaches us in the Bible, it says the heart is wicked, who can know it? That is how it is until it gets cleansed by the blood of Jesus when we come to him. And then it has to get cleansed more and more and again and again. But our heart, it can really get hard and it can really be wicked. That's where things like jealousy and things come from, things that are not good, that can be the precursors to rage and murder and a lot of things. Anyhow, I was very, I had a very arrogant attitude toward the girl who he had gotten pregnant and married. I thought, oh, she can't trap him, like that. And he was my boyfriend before he was her girlfriend. I was with him before she was, as if that meant anything. And I would go out with him. He would leave her at home alone and take me out. And in time, he was telling me about it. He was telling me about how his wife knew about me and that she would cry. And I didn't like hearing that. That started working on me. It really bothered me to realize that he'd be going out with me and she'd be crying. And then to top it all off, on Valentine's Day, he came over and surprised me with a bottle of wine and flowers, and he spent the whole evening with me. And I thought, wow, his own wife, he's not even on Valentine's Day. It was just... it was just bad. And I had gotten to the point where I thought I was infatuated with him. Before I just thought he was kind of cute, but now I guess from the sexual relations with him, I started being more lustful toward him and starting to feel that more. And so I was very selfish about him. But finally, knowing how she was at home hurting because of him going out with me and then him doing that on Valentine's Day, that just really did it for me. And I told him I wouldn't see him anymore. I told him the real reason. He didn't seem to believe me, but it was the truth. And it was pretty, a little too little, a little too late, but at least I did finally break it off with him because of her. And at one point I saw her at an event. I didn't usually go to the events with the guru, but there was some event. Maybe the guru was going to be there, whatever. And I was out in the hallway and I saw her. And it was after I'd broken off with him. And I don't know, I think I wanted to just say hello to her or just maybe apologize to her. I don't know what I was going to say, if I was going to say anything. But when she saw me, she just turned around and looked away. And she wouldn't speak to me. And I don't blame her. So, and then later on, it's so strange. It's so sad. Later he left her. she never knew where he went. I was trying to find him at one point when I was back visiting Denver, and I somehow got their phone number, and his little girl answered the phone. And I asked if she knew where her daddy was. And she said, "We don't know where my daddy is." Oh, that was so sad. And then strangely enough, later in this story, I will be telling you about how I ended up living in the same house as someone who used to be this guy's roommate this guy I'm talking about, before the ashram. And well, just go ahead and tell you now. And what he told me then, when we discovered that we knew that same person, he said, "Wow, he hated women more than any guy I ever met. All he could talk about is how they were all sluts and trash, and just really," he said, "he just hated women." I was so surprised because he would always act to me like he was the, Mr. Gentleman, and like he was, so enamored of me. And actually, after I had gotten out of the mental hospital, when I had been in Denver, I got out because of telling that guy about the black magic. And then for the short time I lived with my parents again after the halfway house incident, I ended up on the phone with him, and he asked me, he said, "Did you go crazy because of me?" And that was really crazy, because he was the last thing on my mind. And I said, "No." And he sounded really disappointed. It's like he wanted to hear that I had gone crazy because of him. That was the last time I ever spoke to him. And anyway, it was just so strange to find out later that what a nasty attitude he had about all women. And there was a point where he had met my stepmother. We went to the restaurant where he was a waiter, and he really played things up to her, and he lied to her and told her that he had asked me to marry him, and that I had said no. And I told her, when I was on the ride home with her later, I said, I don't know why he told you that. He never asked me to marry him. But she seemed to believe him instead of me, and then she was saying, "Oh, he would make such a wonderful son-in-law," and she just thought he was so great. And I didn't tell her. I thought, man, if she only knew that he's a married man and all of that, she would not have been saying all that. Anyway, okay, so that was some of the stuff I didn't tell you about the ashram and just after the ashram there. And now I've got to go back to the parts I skipped over. I skipped on when I lived in New Mexico. Max and I ended up living in several places. And Albuquerque didn't really have they had a city bus system, but it wasn't very good. It didn't cover lots of the areas in the town, and it did not cover the area, an area where we had moved to. It was wherever the bus stop was there. It was way too far to walk. And I needed to be able to get around, and I really needed a car, but I had no money. I was very low in money, and I had a dream one night, and in the dream, I found a used car for $100, which even back then was a really low price to pay for a working used car. In the dream, I saw an ad in the paper for a used car for $100, and I woke up and I felt inspired. I felt like, what if this dream is true? What if it comes true? And so that day, when I went to work, it was a job I had where I didn't get paid. I got paid in items rather than money, but I'll be telling you about that in a minute. And I would have to get rides to go there. And anyway, there was a guy that worked in the back of the shop. It was a body shop. They sold things like body lotions and body oils and little interesting things like wood plates and things from other countries and boxes from that were made in Poland and jewelry and just all kinds of odds and ends, kind of like a hippie style store in a way, very eclectic. Anyway, there was a guy that he was very quiet and kept to himself, but he worked in the back of the shop doing something with stained glass. And I didn't talk to him much, but that day I was excited about my dream, and I said, "Oh, I'm going to have to go get a paper. I've got to look up and see, if there really is a working car that's for sale for $100." And he said, "Oh, do you mean that one over a couple, a few blocks away? That's, I think it was $60. It was either 60 or 80, but I think it was 60." He said, "That $60 car a few blocks away?" And I said, "No, I mean the dream said $100, but 60 sounds a lot better." He says, "Oh well, I'll take you over there at lunchtime. You can see it." And we went over there, and it was an old Ford Falcon automatic, and a weird thing about it was that all the upholstery in the ceiling of that car was held up by toothbrushes. There was toothbrushes in between some kind of wire and something at the top. Must have been 500 toothbrushes all in the top of that car. Clearly, whoever had that car before was a toothbrush salesperson. And but it worked, and I bought it right away. And in New Mexico at the time, there was no such thing as having to get your car inspected. If it drove down the road, you could drive it. And so I didn't have to worry about that. And for the next 6 months that I lived in New Mexico, that car kept running, although toward the end I was having to pour a gallon of water in it every time I was going to go anywhere, because by the time I'd get wherever I was going, all the water would have leaked out and I'd have to put more water in it. So I just kept a bunch of jugs of water in the back, on the floor in the back seat. But other than that, it worked fine for the time that I had it. And I ended up selling it for the same price I bought it for to an old man who was a mechanic, and he just wanted something to tinker with. Anyhow, okay, so also what I left out in that time period was Max met a guy who was, I guess he considered himself an Orthodox Jew, but he didn't go to any synagogues. He was clearly doing his own independent study, and he had an experience where he almost died, something with his digestive system, and he had made a promise to God that if God made him live, that he would spend the rest of his life studying the Kabbalah or something like that, and to serve God. And he lived, and he got on disability, and so he didn't have to work, and he just spent all of his time studying the Torah and I don't know about the Torah, but it was the word Kabbalah is what I kept hearing. And Max had a thing, and I think it was from his reading Aleister Crowley. He wanted to learn more about the Kabbalah, which I have learned is it's really a magic book. It's a book about how to do a certain kind of magic that it's just not, it's treated like it's a holy scripture by certain groups, but it is not, and it's not a book to go by. Anybody who's really into the Kabbalah, there's these either witchcraft or Satanism seems to be where it's going, and I didn't know any of that at the time. And anyway, that guy, his name was Avraham, I used to call him Abraham, and he got really upset, and he said, "I'm not a ham, I'm Avraham." And so I learned how to say it the way he wanted. And his wife's name was Sarah. She was converted from Catholicism to being Jewish. And I don't really know what her story was. I just know she was from New York. And they lived up in the mountains above, I think it was kind of near Santa Fe. They lived up in the mountains in a very, an older house, and it did not have any electricity. It was not wired for electricity, and it had a wood stove. That's how she cooked, was on a wood stove. And it had, I think it did have some running water through. I think there was a pipe that came in for water, and they did not have plumbing otherwise. They had an outhouse, and there was a couple times that we went there and spent the night. It was always, it was winter, and I've always, since way back then, I've always needed to get up in the middle of the night and relieve myself. And that was true back then too, usually more than once at night. And I would have to go and we'd be sleeping inside the house, but then I'd have to get up and go out and walk through the snow to the outhouse to do my business, and then come back and go back to sleep. So I didn't like visiting there very much. But it was kind of fascinating seeing how Sarah would fix all their meals on the wood stove. I'd never seen anybody cook off of a wood stove before, and somehow they seemed to make it all part of their religion. I didn't quite understand how, but she's the one who knew how to make. She didn't call it sourdough, but that's what it was. It was a sourdough bread that had 40% rye, and she ended up teaching me how to make that. Unfortunately, I didn't write it down, and I still don't remember how she had me do it, but it was very different than how I've seen it taught today. Anyway, that was kind of interesting. And then later we moved into another place. It was a duplex, and it was unfortunate. Our neighbors, it was a couple that had a little boy about 4 years old, and I felt so bad for that little boy because when we were in our bedroom, we could hear when they would start yelling at each other and throwing things, and I always felt so bad for that little boy having to live around all that violence and shouting and screaming and fighting. I came within half an inch of calling Child Protective Services, but I was just not really sure if I should, and I ended up not doing it. And of course, since then I've learned about some of the Child Protective Services in the United States have people that are connected with some very nefarious practices, and so maybe it's a good thing I didn't call. I don't know, but it was very sad. Anyhow, and it turned out later, I found out it was the woman, it was the little blonde girl that was being the violent one, and the big hulky biker looking dude, he was the passive one in that couple. That was a trip. So anyway, while we lived there, as we always did, Max had a big stereo system, and he loved to play music all the time, really loud. I didn't necessarily have the same taste in music as he did, but I started learning to like a lot of the things he liked. And he talked me into taking LSD again. I had already given it up. I was glad to not do it anymore, and I was so sure I was never going to do it again, and somehow he talked me into it. And that was the last time, by the way, that I ever did LSD. And of all the trips I had, other than the very first one, it was the least traumatic as far as my experience with it, but it still wasn't good, especially looking back, because I remember looking in the mirror when I was tripping on that acid, and I looked really old. Actually, I looked a lot like I look now when I think about it. It was weird. It was almost like I could see my hair turning white, and my face looked very different. And I think it looked a lot like it does now, only maybe even older. And I was looking in the mirror, and I was thinking, as I always did when I tripped on LSD, once I figured out that the reason I was taking it was because I wanted to feel love. And I was again feeling like I just wasn't feeling the love I wanted. And through taking that drug, I came to the conclusion that I needed to love myself more. And then I could love other people. And I just thought that was so profound. Not realizing what a selfish person I already was. That only caused me to be more selfish. It was so weird. It took me a long time to realize that. I thought it was such a wonderful realization. Oh, I can't love others if I don't love myself. That's sort of a very narcissistic belief system, I'm telling you. Anyhow, and also during that time, I was very relieved that I didn't have any frightening experiences in that particular LSD trip, but it had its mark on me, and it wasn't a good one. And in that same place where we were living at that time, Max got he had saved up enough money. I believe it was because he was selling marijuana, but he did it in a very discreet way, because I never even really saw him doing it, or I saw some of his scales and weight things, but it was very, he was pretty good at keeping it on the undertow. I never knew him to have a job, ever. The whole time I've known him, he never had a job. And that did bother me. Anyway, I mean, it wouldn't have bothered me if he was a farmer or something, but anyway, he'd saved up enough money to pay for a really good plastic surgeon who broke his nose again for him, and then I don't know where he got the bone or gristle to do it, but he built his nose back up a little bit. It really needed to be. It was very painful for him, and I nursed him through that. It took him a long time healing from that, and he never got the same nose, the one that I loved, but he did get a decent looking nose. He became a good looking man again. I think I felt like it really kind of ruined his looks, that bad nose job. It was kind of like a ski slope going sideways, if you were going to exaggerate. Anyway, he got his nose built back up to looking more like a normal nose. And that is so weird, because that's when he started looking like John Travolta. If he shaved his beard off and everything, he looked so much like John Travolta. That was very weird. Anyway, when he had his big nose, he was so cute. It was like a Jimmy Durante nose. It made him look almost cross-eyed, and he was adorable. Anyway, back to, trying to remember if there was anything else. Let's see, Abraham and Sarah. Oh, yeah. So what had happened between living the other place and moving to the duplex, I just wanted to meet some people. I didn't have any friends in Albuquerque, and I just wanted to have people in my life. And like I said, people seemed very cliquish. And they were also very ethnic cliquish. Like you didn't see people of different skin color being friends with each other, it seemed like. I don't remember seeing any black people, but there was lots of Mexicans and white people. And anyway, I really wanted friends, and I wanted a job, but I couldn't find a job that I could do with the clothes that I had, which were kind of hippie-ish looking, and I had some long dresses, but it was not what people usually expect you to wear in offices. But sometimes I got some temporary jobs at offices. Anyhow, I wanted friends, and I discovered that little shop, the Body Bueno shop, where they sold the body oils and lotions and everything. And I applied for a job there. And she said, well, we don't pay money. You would just, would just give you some items from the store, as payment. And because I was doing it, because I wanted friends, that was okay with me. I was willing to do it that way. And then I was so surprised when she hired me, because it seemed like the kind of a store, there must be a lot of people trying to get a job there. And I was so surprised she picked me. And then I found out why my first day there. She was showing me the ropes, and then she said, I decided it was a mistake to have people work here who are my friends. So that's why I picked you, because you're not my friend. And that way it's easier to tell you what to do and this and that. And she made it really real. It was like she was not going to be my friend. And she had a lot of friends, and I was so disappointed. And I let out my anger. This is another thing from my wicked heart. My heart, it was getting more and more wicked, was I would steal things. I would steal things from that shop because, well, she showed me how to do things in such a way where she wouldn't have to pay as many taxes. And I did that same thing in order to help me steal things. And I didn't even necessarily want them, but I was kind of doing it out of revenge and anger that I had gone through all this trouble to take this job where I don't even get paid money, and now she's not going to be my